Thank you for downloading the book from the royalib.com free e-library, http://royalib.com. All books by the author, http://royalib.com/author/Saakashvili_Mikhail.html. The same book in other formats, http://book//Esokos6li_Mikhail/6s+9_N_608oi_608_j_nes_ambassadorlei_un.html. Enjoy reading. Michael Saakashvili. Speech at the 68th session of the UN General Assembly. Mr. President, Your Excellency and distinguished delegates, it is a big part for me to represent my country in this organization again. Over the past decades, as I once said, Georgia has gone from decline to democracy with a market economy. We fully felt both all the difficulties and the positive moments. We had both breakthroughs and mistakes. But the world was able to understand at what price the freedom of the country cost us. Today I ask you to once again hear the voice of our nation, which respects the political, religious and social differences of people, in order to come together to freedom. It is a voice that, despite all the problems, and despite all the difficulties that we still have to face, is full of hope. I look at the world today, and I understand that this voice of hope is needed. The optimism of the early 1990s, when democratic and liberal values were spreading very quickly, when there was a feeling of the end of history, when it seemed that the UN was the soul and heart of the world, and when I was a student here in New York and I was doing an internship in UN, this optimism was shattered by a wave of skepticism and pessimism. The world is no longer the same. Human rights are rethought. And the UN did not become the soul and heart of our planet. Western civilization, once triumphant, is now struggling to cope with a deep economic, social and intellectual crisis. In Eastern Europe, the color revolutions are again facing their opponents, whom they defeated a few years ago. In the Middle East, joyful images of jubilant Tunisians, the Egyptians, were replaced by horrific pictures of dead children in the vicinity of Damascus. There are many reasons for disappointment and disillusionment, but should the dogmatic optimism of the 1990s be replaced by a dogmatic pessimism that kills hope? Should the fact of the spread of freedom and democracy force us to stop our struggle, to change our views and our principles? I have come here today to share with you the hopes of my people. And in order to speak on behalf of his people about the rejection of this all-encompassing fatal pessimism, I am here to speak to those who hesitate and doubt. And if the Western model is out of date, then why are millions of Poles, Romanians, Estonians and Czechs so happy to join NATO? And why millions of Ukrainians, Georgians and Moldovans are knocking at the door of the European Union? If freedom is not in fashion today, then how can we say that Tunisians have changed the map of the world? No, the story didn't end in 1989 or 1991, and it never will. Freedom is still the driving force of history. Men and women all over the world want to live in freedom. But the question is, will we be actors or spectators in this confrontation? Dear delegates, as I said, many Eastern European countries have joined the European free and democratic community, but they are constantly threatened and intimidated. Armenia was forced to sign an agreement on joining the customs union, which is not in the interests of the Armenians and our region. Moldova is in a state of blockade. Ukraine is constantly under attack. Azerbaijan is facing extreme pressure. And Georgia is occupied. Why? Because the empire is trying to recover within its former borders. The word boundaries, in this case, of course, is not entirely correct. Neither the Russian Empire, nor the Soviet Union, nor the Eurasian Union have ever had borders. They only had margins. And today, I speak on behalf of these suburbs. Unlike most Russians, the government of this country is not interested in their neighbors having a stable environment. There should always be unrest in the countries that are around Russia. That's what the Kremlin wants. They deny the very idea of a strong government in neighboring countries. In Georgia, Ukraine or Moldova, they try to take into account the interests of Russia. I have never been a fan of what the French call la langue de bois, pouring water. But my second term is now coming to an end, so I understand that now I need to be frank about this. I'll try to be specific. Do you think Vladimir Putin wants an unconditional triumph of Armenia over Azerbaijan, for example? No. This will make Armenia too strong and potentially too independent. Do you think that the opposite scenario, that is, the prevalence of Baku over Yerevan, will satisfy Moscow? Of course not. The current rise of a modernized Azerbaijan is a nightmare for Russian leaders. No, they don't want anyone to win, because the conflict itself is their goal. Therefore, it is the conflict that forces both sides to be in a state of dependence and blocks their integration into the European community. Do you think that the electoral defeat of the Orange Revolution forces in Ukraine forced the Kremlin to soften its policy towards this country? Just the opposite. The government headed by Viktor Yanukovych is under constant attack. The trade war unleashed against Ukraine on the eve of the European summit in Vilnius has become a tool for Russia to split this country. Do you think that the Kremlin will agree to discuss the process of deoccupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia after the government is replaced in Tbilisi? Absolutely not. The annexation of Georgian territories by Russian soldiers continues. Yesterday, the occupiers again expelled Georgian citizens from their homes and villages, and these are, after all, the houses and villages of their ancestors. All this happens in the light of day and with complete impunity. Despite the friendly statements made by the new Georgian government over the past few weeks and months, the Russian army continues to strengthen its position, dividing the settlements with barbed wire, threatening our economy, approaching the vital Baku-Supsa pipeline, as well as the main Georgian highway, which calls into question the entire stability of our state. The hostility of Vladimir Putin and his team towards the government that I had the honor to lead for almost 10 years is not based on personal hatred or cultural rejection. Any such judgment is essentially a front for a cover. My predecessor, President Shevardnadze, comes from the Soviet nomenclatura. In the 90s, he was brought to power during a military riot in Georgia and with the direct help of Russia. He is known as thanks to his Soviet diplomatic views, which I do not have. Still, Russia undermined his authority and even made several attempts to kill him. And this is not about Gamsakhurdia, Shevardnadze, Saakashvili, or Ivanishvili. Names mean absolutely nothing when the stakes are so high. This is a question about the possibility or impossibility of a state in Georgia. Why? Because the current Russian government knows very well that as soon as strong state systems are created in Ukraine, Georgia or Moldova, at the same time the governments will reflect the aspirations of their people who, among other things, want to be completely independent and move towards Europe. The Georgian experience of successful reforms and the real functioning of the state can become a real virus, a virus that will spread throughout the post-Soviet space, and which, according to Russia, must be eliminated by any possible means. That is why the Georgian people were forced to face the embargo, the war, the invasion and the occupation. And this has all happened since 2006. But that is precisely why the resistance of the Georgian people and the restoration of Georgian democracy are so important for the entire region. Ladies and gentlemen, attempts to roll back the prospects of the European Union and NATO in our region are becoming even more intense. And these attempts have a definite name: it is the Eurasian Union. The Eurasian Union was created in order to become an alternative to the European Union. Putin presented it as the main project of his presidency. Because European and Euro-Atlantic integration takes a long time, because it requires huge efforts, because sometimes it may seem that you are heading for a mirage, because the threats can be so strong and the pressure unbearable, because the prospects are very unclear. Why not give it up? Today I would like to explain why you should not refuse. Much more international politics and more international alliances. Our peoples are concerned about social issues and lifestyle choices. Our people must choose whether they want to live in a world of fear and crime, a world where they are persecuted for being different and minorities are like punching bags, a world where the opposition faces beatings and selective justice, a world, ladies and gentlemen, that we all know very well, for we all came out of it. The Eurasian Union is our recent past and our future, which was created by former KGB agents in Moscow. On the other hand, our traditions and our age-old aspirations show us the way to another world called Europe. The European communities are also not ideal, and if we move towards them, we will also face fears, hopes, anger, and even hatred. But in this case, meritocracy prevails over nepotism, tolerance becomes the foundation of social life, today's opponents can become tomorrow's ministers, and not prisoners or enemies to be destroyed. For the peoples of Eastern Europe, the choice is becoming so obvious that Kremlin strategists, who call themselves political technologists, have decided to abolish the concept of truth and create only lies that they spread throughout Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia and other countries. Their mouthpieces in our esteemed countries. This is a conscious or unconscious fifth column, call the European Union an instrument for the destruction of human values, for the erosion of national traditions and for the promotion of LGBT ideas. It's strange, but in recent years, or maybe even weeks, in Tbilisi, Kiev and Chisinau we hear the same barrel organ, which was first launched in Moscow. We hear that our traditions are crumbling under the influence of the West, that Christian holidays will soon replace gay parades, and churches will turn into multicultural Disneylands. We hear that our traditional self-identity is about to be threatened. But are we so naive as to believe in these lies, lies that have been believed for generations, lies that have stolen our sovereignty? Are we so unfair to our ancestors as to believe that their memory can be honored through attacks on mosques and pogroms? We must have no memory of our own history if we can let it repeat itself endlessly. When we hear the false chants of the Orthodox sung by the Russian imperialists, do we really forget the righteous voice of Patriarch Kirill, who was killed, or the eternal voice of Patriarch Ambrosius Hele, who was tortured for days and weeks only because he spoke out in Geneva against the invasion of his own country? Are we deaf, since we do not hear the voices of the murdered bishops and priests? Are we uneducated if we don't remember who repainted our churches and erased our holy frescoes? Are we blind, since we do not see the destruction of our churches in the occupied territories? We must know our history. And it teaches us that tolerance is the basis of the sovereignty of our region. This is not only a moral duty. This is a matter of national security. We must know our history and understand that the old principle of divide and rule applies today just as it did 2 centuries ago. Looking at our region today, those who know the history of the Caucasus should remember the massacre of Armenians and Azerbaijanis in 1905, which was artificially created by the Tsarist regime, and compare it with the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh in the late 80s. We can also recall the beginning of the war in Abkhazia in the early 1990s. Then the Georgian members of the armed formations received weapons from Russian soldiers, who actually controlled the Abkhaz rebels and Chechen terrorists. It was they who destroyed any solidarity between the north and south of the Caucasus. Also, more than a century ago, Russia sent Georgian officers to fight Chechens, Ingush and Dagestanis at the front. We can also look at other outskirts of the empire, for example, study the history of Poland or Ukraine, and we will see exactly the same thing. Everywhere the empire kindled hatred between the oppressed peoples and separated them with a wall of fanatical antagonism. And this system, unfortunately, worked. But what is even more frustrating is that this system still works today. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, the European Union is the greatest political success of recent decades. It stands on 3 foundations, namely 3 denials: the denial of extremist nationalism, which led Europe to the suicidal world wars and horrors of Nazism, the denial of communism, which threatened to spread across the continent, and, ultimately, the denial of colonialism and imperialism. It took some time for the heirs of the French and British empires to come to terms with the third denial, but giving up their colonies was the price to pay for modernizing their economies and developing their democracy, as well as realizing the EU itself. The Eurasian Union is based on radically different principles. It is run by intolerance, ex-KGB agents, and is set up to revive the empire. Of course, joining the Eurasian Union is very simple. To do this, you do not need to meet any social, economic, or political criteria. In fact, in order to be a colony, you do not need to possess anything. The only requirements are passivity and mediocrity. On the other hand, in order to enter into a real union, there is no other way than to make titanic efforts and meet strict criteria, because these principles are at the head of the entire union. So for the doubters, I would like to emphasize that the choice is obvious precisely because the EU requires effort and puts forward criteria, and precisely because the EU does not want to absorb us. But there is an even better reason, which shows the obviousness of the choice. The Russian project is destined to fail. No empire can survive now. And Russian too. If we turn to history, we will see that France and Great Britain lost their colonies not only because the colonies fought for their independence, but also because the people in Paris and London stopped believing in their empire. The same thing is happening in Russia now. The imperial dream first meets resistance on its outskirts. But, more importantly, this dream is also rejected in the center of the empire. Denial can be seen not only in the mass protests and the growing popularity of the opposition in Russia's major cities. There is also denial in the all-encompassing skepticism of the Russian elites towards Putin's Eurasian ideas. The people who are called to serve this idea do not themselves believe in its viability. Rejected both in the outskirts of the empire and in its center, this idea leads to death. The Eurasian Union will fail, and Russia will again have borders, not outskirts. Then this country will start looking for stable relations with stable neighbors. Then cooperation will replace confrontation. All this will happen much sooner than people think, and from this, of course, the outskirts will benefit, but even more, the people themselves in Russia. The imperial project is doomed and absurd, because the current generation of Russian citizens spends the most time in the world on the internet. The collapse will also happen because the endless resources of gas and oil will soon collide with promising gas and oil from offshore fields. The collapse will happen because gas cannot replace the modernization of the economy. The collapse will happen because there is corruption and lack of justice. The collapse will happen because entire regions of Russia suffer from discrimination and violence, because the peoples of Chechnya, Ingushetia, Dagestan, Tatarstan and other regions are so persecuted that they do not feel any connection with Moscow. The collapse is inevitable because people experience discontent, fear, hatred. The collapse is inevitable. And it will happen not in the next decades, but in the next few years. In a few years, Vladimir Putin will leave the Kremlin and disappear from Russian politics. The citizens of Russia will remember him as a ghost of bygone times, times of empire, times of corruption and suppression. No one knows whether this process will be calm or brutal, whether its next head of state will be a nationalist or a liberal, or both, but what matters is that Russia will cease to be an empire and will finally become an ordinary state. This is a prospect for which we must all be prepared. In the meantime, as long as our region continues to be a battlefield, we need to join forces rather than exacerbate the conflict. In the past, many leaders and many countries realized that the freedom of one person depends on the freedom of the nation. So it was in Pilsudski's time in Poland, when all offended people were called to the country under the banner of the Polish flag of independence. But our ancestors never cooperated with a powerful force that understood the strategic importance of our independence. Now there is such a force, and it is the European Union. The Eastern Partnership Summit will soon take place in Vilnius. I would like to repeat what I have said many times over the past few years. By launching the Eastern Partnership Program in response to the invasion of Georgia in 2008, the European Union offered our countries a platform for cooperation. We need to invest more in this platform. We must develop joint projects, first of all, focus on the reforms we need. Because reforms mean prosperity and independence. Catherine too knew this very well. When Poland began to successfully carry out its reform program and began to follow the French and English enlighteners, Catherine wrote a secret letter to Frederick the Great. This letter is still one of the most impressive examples of imperial thinking. It says that the reforms are dangerous both for Russia and for Prussia, because they will make a real state out of Poland, and the reforms must be stopped, and Poland should be attacked, and moreover, as soon as possible. This letter may sound familiar to anyone who knows how much Vladimir Putin hates the Georgian reforms of the last decade. For the first time in history, a people's state is being built on the territory of the Caucasus, and the reforms must be stopped before they bear all the fruits. Ladies and gentlemen, unity must be our rule in Eastern Europe, including the disparate Caucasus. I have already spoken about the beginning of the war in Abkhazia, but I can recall other earlier symbolic episodes from Caucasian history. At the end of Shamel's uprising against the Russian Empire, after Shamil himself surrendered, there was only one Chechen leader who continued to fight. His name was Baysongur. But he was also wounded and captured. He was about to be hanged, and Russian officers gathered Dagestanis to watch the execution. One of them was ordered to knock out a stool from under Baysongur's feet. So the Russians wanted to play off the peoples and incite a bloody massacre. Seeing this, Baysongur himself knocked out a chair from under his feet and thus committed suicide. This is forbidden by religion, but he stopped the enmity of the two peoples of the neighbors. But listen, how many misfortunes did the Caucasian nations have? This must come to an end. And that is why, during my presidency, I launched several projects that should improve relations between the north and south of the Caucasus, projects aimed at education and university exchange. We must continue to take such small steps. We must be prepared for the times when the empire falls. That way we can survive a hateful legacy. And we, the people of Georgia, must be prepared for the times when Russian soldiers leave the occupied territories, when Moscow leaves Tskhinvali and Sukhumi. We must be ready to welcome the return of our fellow citizens from Ossetia and Abkhazia. And we should treat them like brothers and sisters. Not as an enemy. These times will come sooner than we think. Ladies and gentlemen, my second term is drawing to a close and I am proud of the accomplishments we have made. We literally pulled Georgia out of the darkness, created unprecedented transparency in government structures, returned children to schools and dealt with youth crime. We have brought our nation closer to the European dream. We have worked tirelessly to bring back a sense of tolerance to our country, a feeling that has guided Georgia in the past. We have done a lot of good things. But I understand that some achievements were given too high a price. In our attempt to create a new reality that is different from past times of threats and fears, we have made mistakes. Sometimes we went too far, and sometimes we didn't. I fully acknowledge my responsibility for all shortcomings, and I am concerned about those who did not get enough good from our work and about those who fell victim to our radical methods. I would like to say to all the citizens of Georgia, to everyone who supported our work, our policy and our party, and to everyone who was dissatisfied with us, I am proud of your strength and courage. I respect your efforts. We are and must continue to be a nation that is united in the love of freedom and dignity. We are and must remain a nation that respects the sacrifices of our soldiers in Afghanistan, a nation that mourns its losses and prides itself on its courage. We are and must remain a nation that is united in our historical destiny to join the European family of democratic nations, a family from which we can never be separated, our family. The path of the people of Georgia to freedom, regional unity and European integration is far from over, and I will continue to devote every day of my life to the completion of this cause. Like a proud son of his proud people, thank you. Thank you for downloading the book from the royalib.com free e-library, http://royalib.com. Leave a review about the book, http://Saakashvili_Mikhail/6li_Mikhail/6s_6s_Sambassador_un.html. All books by the author, http://royalib.com/author/Saakashvili_Mikhail.html.